Hey, I'm Jim Porter over here, and I hope you can see me. Yeah, you can see me. Today I'm going to offer my critique of libertarianism. In this video, I will be arguing three things. First, I want to remind you to please like and subscribe this channel and hit the bell so you can get notifications. And please make comments down below about what I've said in today's presentation. So in this video, I will be arguing three things. One is that libertarianism falsely assumes that there is a right to property without government. However, property rights cannot exist without government. That's my first point. The second point is economy or economic activity and group governance are human traits. We cannot not form governments, and we cannot not engage in trade. And there is no way to separate trade and government. That's point number two. Point number three is libertarianism relies on the false assumption that there is an invisible hand of the market that will take care of everything if people can conduct economic activity free of governmental control. However, I'm not going to argue necessarily that there is no free hand, but I am going to argue that there cannot exist an invisible hand if people are acting freely. People cannot act freely if there is an invisible hand. So I'm going to start with the point number one. Libertarianism falsely assumes there is a right to property without government. And I'm going to assert that property rights cannot exist without government. So for starters, political libertarians believe that people have, among other rights, a right to their own acquired property. And they seem to be somewhat against regulating how people acquire their property. They believe everyone has a right to defend their own rights, including property rights, not necessarily by force, but by force if necessary. They would champion, I think, a person using their own firearms to prevent someone from harming them or from stealing from them or their family members. But the belief that a person has the right to acquire and defend their own property with no regulations on how they can do so is incoherent. Those ideas do not go together. Let me give you an example. If a libertarian family is shot to death by a libertarian trespasser who then occupies their home, the dead libertarian family would philosophically be required to say, "This seems fair. The assailant acquired our land by his own chosen method. We lost the gun battle. It is now his property to defend," or her property. They would have to acknowledge that though the assailant violated their rights to life and property, there was no regulation against it. They failed to defend their life and property rights. And that's just on them. They'll just take the hit for that because that's the libertarian philosophy. Unless libertarians flatter themselves that they will win every battle to defend their individual rights, they must realize they need a larger group watching their backs. They most likely understand that such an arrangement would require spoken or written agreements. It would require an expectation that those agreements be followed, that there would be incentives to inspire such adherence, and disincentives for those who break the agreements. In short, they couldn't believe in a free and just society without communally enforced regulation. Government is how human beings created property rights. Governments in the past, including the US government, specified who had property rights and denied property rights to those who weren't specified to have that right. Governments is what enforces people's rights and codifies those rights in things like constitutions. So that's that. There's no such a thing as a life without government. It just can't happen for humans and other social animals. Second point, economic activity and group governance are human traits. We cannot not form governments and we cannot not engage in traits. and there is no way to separate trade from government or government from trade. So, for starters, to be human is to be economic. All human activity is economic interaction. We buy and sell, give and take, provide or withhold. Even what we think of as just normal social interaction is transactional. When we are talking to each other, we are sharing ideas, providing value. For example, a singer wants money in return for singing because that very act of intoning things with their voice is considered valuable. Everything, everything, everything can be commodified. Sex, speaking, drawing, swimming, walking, keeping someone company, caring for children, having children, everything can be commodified. Even when things are not consciously commodified, there is an exchange still in all interactions. We all seek, consciously or unconsciously, something in return for whatever we do or give. Even if all we get is that good feeling inside that we get from giving, that good feeling signifies the safety and security that comes with closeness, creating more of those you can count on me type relationships. That feeling is your payoff, and that potential security of being in good standing with your relationship, with your community, is your payoff. That's a give and take, a transaction. Sometimes you don't get what you want out of an interaction, and you might feel cheated. That's because it's all transactional. So every interaction is economic, and all human activity is economic activity. The second point in this section is that to be human is to govern and be government. Or to be human is to govern and be governed. Government is a human activity. It does not seem to me that any human groups have existed without government. Government is a system of organizing groups. Organized groups have government. We always have groups and some organization. Some organization. Enforcement is part of keeping groups organized. Enforcement can take various forms. For example, force can be physical or force can be emotional. Actually, force is always emotional. It is our social emotional reactivity that keeps groups cohesive and organized. Even the threat of force relies on a person feeling that sense of that threat. Without the threat of force, we would still feel all the threats associated with other human needs and deprivations, like the threat associated with abandonment, starvation, lack of help when we need it, absence of love, loss of friendship, missing out on good times, and a shortage of comfort, like sleeping on the sidewalk instead of in a nice, cozy bed. We all have those threats in our mind that keep us governed by our group. So, to trade is to govern is to trade. According to Oxford Languages Online, capitalism is, quote, an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit. That is government. Capitalism is a form of government. The owners govern trade and industry. Those who own the most are the supreme ruling powers in capitalism. Everyone else is under their control. That's how you're living if you're living in the United States and other places who are largely ruled by capitalism. It is a form of government. Capitalism is only one of many rule and structures that can arise out of the human impulse to take care of needs in an organized way through a group. All government is created by inventing and asserting human rights and then protecting those rights by restricting those rights on a case-by-case basis. Like, I'm not allowed to kill you except under certain circumstances. Now, recall my example in which an intruder took ownership of a home by killing the family previously occupying it. This would be a form of individualized government with each person governing themselves. The only enforcement would be individual violence or threat of violence or force. This would be the polar opposite of capitalism, actually. Everybody's their own government and is allowed to do whatever they want as long as they win. That only lasts for a while because it starts to get organized by who's the most powerful with the gun or the club or whatever. But also the problem with anarchy, right, is that it has no group enforcement of individual rights. So individual enforcement is the opposite of capitalism. Anarchy is the opposite of capitalism. The problem with capitalism is that the most powerful run the government. Thus, they freely exercise their rights without hindrance, and they freely restrict the rights of everyone else. In capitalism, you vote with your dollar. This means most people's votes make no difference. Democracy and republicanism are similar, and they are examples of self-governance through an organization. Unfettered from capitalism, they have the power to count each vote equally. They also have the power to aggregate votes into community responses like in the Electoral College and state delegates. But either way, a single vote is allowed for each individual person on one level or another. Either you directly vote for the president, for example, or you vote for the electors who will then cast their vote for the president. So when certain rights are expanded and restricted, we have had some power in deciding those expansions and restrictions of rights, or we have had power to decide who is going to make a decision on expanding and restricting certain rights, which is constantly what government is doing. So we're electing representatives, which is clearly better than real capitalism ruling. Currently, we have capitalism helping decide, or maybe outright choosing, that's probably too strong of a statement, who gets to be put in office. So we currently, if we have a real democracy or a real public, we have some say in deciding when trade is becoming theft, for example, like when somebody gets your house because they shot you. We have some say in what's okay in acquiring property from other people. Economics and governance are very similar. But in economics, those with the most dollars have the most votes. In governance, we can give everyone an equal vote. Now to point number 3. Libertarian relies on the false assumption that there is an invisible hand of the market that will take care of everything if people can conduct economic activity free of governmental control. However, there cannot exist an invisible hand if people are acting freely. People cannot act freely if there is an invisible hand guiding everything. The invisible hand contradicts freedom of choice. It contradicts free will itself. Adam Smith himself didn't seem to realize that he was actually asserting what I just said. But he was. In this quote I have from The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Part 4, Chapter 1, pages 184 through 5, paragraph 10. The rich he says, consume little more than the poor, and in spite of their natural selfishness and rapacity, they divide with the poor the produce of all their improvements. They are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessaries of life, which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions among all its inhabitants. And thus, without intending it, without knowing it, they advance the interest of the society and afford means to the multiplication of the species. He's saying that even the meanest, most rapacious people are just being forced by the invisible hand to make decisions that help everyone out. That's not coherent. You can't be free to make decisions and be forced by an invisible hand. Fair enough. I don't believe in free will anyway. So here in this quote from Adams, in The Wealth of Nations, Book 4, Chapter 5, Digression on the Corn Trade, page 540, paragraph B, 43, Smith is saying that it is the nature-endowed behavior of people, not the people themselves, that does all the deciding. However, he then contradicts himself by not recognizing that the same natural effort, is what he calls it, is what compels humans to make laws. The same invisible natural inclinations we have to barter and trade is the same natural inclination we have to make governments and laws. Here's the quote from Adams. The natural effort of every individual, let me start that again. The natural effort of every individual to better his own condition is so powerful that it is alone and without any assistance, not only capable of carrying on the society to wealth and prosperity, but of surmounting 100 impertinent obstructions with which the folly of human laws too often encumbers its operation. You see, in that quote, there is not choice, no free will in the concept of the invisible hand. It controls our very behavior. In my experience, many libertarians believe that if people are allowed to act freely in their own self-interests, the invisible hand of the free market will synthesize all those choices for the benefit of everyone and all people. So the invisible hand of the market is, in this day and age, described as allowing all people unfettered freedom to act on self-interest without cluttering their choices with other considerations. The market will then take care of all human behaviors and interactions to bring the outcomes that are best for all. However, the invisible hand cannot exist unless we do not have free will. If we do not have free will, the invisible hand is a marvelous metaphor for all of life. And the fact is that we probably don't have free will. So let's just say what we do have is an invisible hand. As a human, you receive inputs from what we call the environment. And then those inputs are processed through your unique biological configuration and emerge from you as behaviors. Even your thoughts and emotions are just behaviors emitted as your internal structure processes external data. What you call you is never disconnected from the natural forces and environmental inputs. You are constantly connected, wired to your immediate surroundings, receiving inputs from your environment and outputting responses that, in turn, become inputs to the environment from you. In fact, this shows that you are a feature, a portion, a cog, a little dimple, a finger of the environment. So, yes, you don't exist even as a separate object. There is only one object, and that is what we look out and call the universe. We are just details of the universe. This is not to say that the natural forces are consciously making decisions for us. They do what they do, and we are a result. So, yes, the invisible hand it is real, and it controls everything you do and everything that happens to it. And you are a finger of the invisible hand. We are merely meat machines created, controlled, and eventually destroyed by natural forces. Now, there is probably finally someone out there thinking, Jim, if there is no free will, why do you even bother speaking out and trying to change people's minds about political topics? The answer is because I can't help it, because I don't have free will. I am completely compelled by the forces of nature to be doing and saying what I am doing and saying. I don't have a choice, but the forces of nature compel me to feel like I'm choosing what I'm doing and saying right now. Not only do the natural forces dictate what I can do, they dictate what I want to do. They dictate to me what I want. That's the same for you, too. You don't want what you want, you just want what you've been made to want. Now, some people might worry that this truth will erase all purpose and meaning from life. Well, it could, but I think that's somewhat doubtful. Human beings can't help but think and feel that life has some purpose, some goal, some ultimate pre planned culmination to achieve. The exception is probably when there's depression or when we just feel like we don't need to have a purpose. So, if you believe in the invisible hand of the marketplace, you logically have to believe in the invisible hand of all things. You have to give up the concept of free will. You have to concede that you are a robot controlled by the invisible hand, acting completely on impulses programmed into you by that hand. I can live with this. I don't believe in free will anyway. I can't even help myself from writing, rehearsing, and saying these things into this camera. I have no actual purpose for doing this, even though I feel strongly about it and I believe it will make a difference. I'm just a finger of the invisible hand, like I said before. And you watching or listening to this can't help but be influenced to some degree by just hearing these words. I can't control what direction that influence will be, but I'm compelled by the invisible hand to do this anyway. Now, it occurs to me that if there is an invisible hand guiding everything, it has guided us to create governments all around the world, each with their own laws, governmental structures, and perhaps concepts of rights and obligations. The invisible hand of the free market created the regulated market through us. If you have a problem with the regulated market and the government, blame the free hand of the market for creating those things. The invisible hand does not have any intention anyway. It really is just a metaphor for the forces of nature. It likely has no purpose. It just mindlessly moves in ways that control the world, a world which includes us little meat puppets. That doesn't bother me either. Whether life was built by a purposeful creator or a purposeless process, I'm having the same experience. So there's no problem. And libertarianism doesn't work.